Hello and welcome to the Elephant Podcast. My name is Patrick Kadara and I'm curator for the elephant.info. Today we're joined by George Kegoro, who is the Executive Director of the Kenya Human Rights Commission, and he will help us discuss what's happening in the country at the moment, especially in the aftermath of the October 26th election, the annulment of the August 8th election. How did we get here as a country, and what are the options that we have going forward? So we can just get right to it. George, perhaps you could just start by giving us your sense of where the country is at the moment following the October 26th election.
I think the country is in a position of stalemate. We've had an election, actually two elections, the one of 8th of August and the one of 26th of October, and technically we have had results from the elections, which is what we look for when we go into elections, but those results have not resolved the underlying political problems. So there's a sense in which elections haven't helped us to move the country forward.
In terms of the underlying political problems that you speak about, what are these? How do we always seem to constantly as a country end up here where we are contesting, especially the presidential election?
I think what we have is a contestation for control of the state, and that contestation is carried out using rules that on paper are clear, but in practice are far from satisfactory. When those rules are implemented, they're unclear. So in effect, we are making the rules as we go on, and the effect of that contestation is such that it will not produce a result where everyone is happy to move on, because one side would always feel that the rules have not been applied in a manner that meets the expectations.
Is this an issue of legitimacy, of having large proportions of the population simply unhappy with the fact that they lost, or that they think they have lost unfairly?
I think we have got to step back a bit and see. First, it's contestation over control of the state, but that contestation is by elites or blocks of elites who position themselves as representing people who are largely identified on the basis of ethnicity. So this is a contestation by along identity lines. So the fact that it is on the one hand a contestation of along identity lines, rather than a contestation that is based on ideas, it just means that it is losing or winning makes it that more difficult to accept. But secondly, because of the manner in which that contestation is organized, the temptation is to play dirty, and the temptation is to play other than in accordance with the rules, and to compromise the entities that were established to ensure that the contest was viewed as credible. So we've got a situation where nothing will be satisfactory unless we step back and say, why are we doing this in the first place? How did we get ourselves here? We've got to step back and try and talk about it in a manner that would then rejig what elections mean as a democratic practice.
Right, yeah, and what we'd like to do here is to step back and to actually start discussing the issues that we just raised about how we got here, and to ask those questions. It seems to me that we have constantly as a country ended up with contestations specifically about the presidential election. And this has been ongoing all the way since the 90s and 92 after we got multi-party. But even before, the discussion had been about reforming the state so we could have contestations about the presidency. And my question is, did we at some point go for the form rather than the substance of reform, so that we changed the framework of electoral politics, but not the basis on which they were run?
I think, in a sense, you can say that as a country, looked at as a whole, and we can be hard on ourselves. If you look at us, at the country historically, the the sad and concerning as the current contestation is, we've actually made progress in objective terms. In the 60s and 70s, the president was Jomo Kenyatta, and there was very little anything could do about changing that, really. And if anybody tried to say the president is, I mean, maybe somebody else, then there were certain reactions that were expected.
Right.
Moi came, and for a long time was also too strong to brook competition. And later on, of course, competition came, and Moi, the competition against his hold on power was unstoppable after some time. So he allowed it and started a process of managing it. In fact, it is that allowing for alternative politics that led to the end of Kanu rule in 2002, and then brought us to NAC and to the more recent moments. So to the extent that incumbents can lose power and suffer a real threat of loss of power, and to the extent that opposition groups have real expectations that they can organize and win political power, the country has made progress. And that is why politics has become a lot more zero-sum, because the threat of loss of power to the incumbent is actually real. And they've got to work harder to keep themselves in power. The issue of concern has got to be, why do people fight so hard to retain power, and why do people fight so hard to take power from those who are fighting hard to retain power? They are fighting to retain power, to keep themselves in power, to keep control of the state for really personal ends, rather than the ends of larger society, rather than the common welfare. So to the extent that we have reformed the institutions, and we've reformed the purpose for which power is public power. You see, when we come together and set up a constitution, the constitution creates public power. It also creates ways of controlling that public power, and how it can be accessed, and so on and so forth. So it's a whole framework around power, and how it can be, how it's created, how it's accessed, how it is limited, and so on and so forth. So on paper it looks beautiful, and the purpose for which public power is created to begin with is also specified in the Constitution. But in practice, it doesn't work like that. It is very much down the path of people then keep control of the state and control of power for themselves, and for their own, for the benefit of really a very, very small group of people. It is really for personal gain, personal economic gain above everything else, and it also then feeds into narratives in our particular case about our identity is the only one that is good enough, strong enough that to be deserving of accessing and controlling public power.
This is our ethnic identity.
Yes, it's our identity, ethnic identity. So that is where it starts becoming a problem.
The Constitution itself is a product of a process that we've been going through, I think, since the 60s, to essentially the point of it was to reform the state that we inherited from the British. Do you feel we have been successful in that endeavor, and to what extent have we actually been successful?
I think the constitution, again, you can have a long-term view, and if we take a long-term view, we've actually come a very long way from the 60s, when, again, if you take, for example, the what happened at the end of when we abolished Majimbo, and the constitution was amended to absorb the senators who were part of the Majimbo system into the National Assembly. Those are things that could be done in a particular in a context of civic disempowerment. The executive could behave and behaved in whichever manner it wanted. So to the extent that we've had civic empowerment resulting from the universalization of literacy, more people are getting an education, more people are getting becoming aware of what a government can and can't do and would question. So those types of things that used to happen in the 60s and maybe in the 70s, some of them cannot take place now. So on a long-term trajectory, we have made progress, but that progress has not been enough. It hasn't. It is definitely not sufficient to save us from the risk of tyranny. And in the recent past, in the context of the current electoral cycle, the choices of liberty and tyranny have become starkly part of what we've got to confront.
Right. The reason I asked about the reforming of the state, as you said a bit earlier, that we still have a situation where people are contesting over control of the state because it gives them personal benefits. We know the colonial state was set up, in essence, to benefit a very tiny minority who are then the British colonials, at the expense of the rest of Kenyans. It seems to me our state still does the same. We've got statistics such as those that say 8,000 individuals own 60 to 62% of our wealth. It seems all our resources are still being fed up the chain to the people at the top, and that this is what people are fighting for. They're fighting to control the state rather than reform it so it becomes broadly representative and it works for everybody. Is this your sense? And if it is, how do we start changing that? And is it simply enough to put in the structures and the forms, such as devolution, or do we need something more?
I think to a significant extent, the state remains the sole possession of a very narrow and small group of people. And one of the reasons why then identity politics, ethnic politics has been hoisted so strongly is because then it is the type of thing that helps to prevent questioning. The state is ours, so this group, because it belongs to the group that is in power, gives implicit and blind support, and that prevents hard questions at the behest of that group. And
so they basically use ethnicity, or they hype up ethnicity, so we don't have a discussion over who controls the state.
Exactly. We abridge any meaningful discussion around values and around the state, because then we hype up through hyping up of ethnicity.
Yeah, but how then do we start tackling that as a society?
I think we've got to step back. I mean, there's got to be a set of people who are willing and to demonstrate, first of all, that what we've said is the problem, and demonstrate it to a large section of society, as to then develop a followership that is capable of establishing an alternative brand of politics. That in principle is possible. but it's difficult because also you will not exist in an island. The existing situation will fight back. It will not allow a threat to its power, a threat to the way in which it controls the state to easily flourish. So you are going to it's easier to organize an alternative way of doing politics in principle. It's possible, but it's not easy. But that's what is then required, and that is the challenge.
Okay. You spoke about the constitution from the looking back at the 60s. In 1962, we enacted a constitution that was supposed to help us reform the colonial state. And it is broadly similar to the constitution we had in we enacted in 2010, in the sense that it allowed for majimboism, or regional governments, which is the equivalent of devolution. It had a Bill of Rights. Many of the salient features of our constitution were there, but that constitution was then degraded. By 69 it had completely changed, and it had become another unitary state, really controlled by one person. Does our current constitution face the same threat?
It definitely does. But one of the things that is in favor of the moment that was not there in the 60s is, first, we have lessons from history. And those lessons from history put us in a better position to fight manifestations or new manifestations of tyranny or rollback on how we've decided we're going to organize the state. But secondly, the power of education. It is something that we have achieved over a long time. The fact that we've got a more educated population that in principle is more engaged. People who are questioning have got a capacity to question and to engage in a way that then makes it more difficult for those in power to do just what they want. Thirdly, we have the role of media. Ideas are more easily discussable by a large section of the population. Media, technology, and all that, all the trappings of modernity, they make repression that much more difficult.
Right.
It is not impossible, but it is a lot more difficult because universalization of education. You've got people are moving across the country and settling in different places, and plurality of ideas and so on and so forth. So those are advantages that we didn't have in the 60s, which we've been building over the years. So there's really, in the end, there is hope. Although there is also the possibility and the danger of anarchy, because if the dominant group is not strong enough to impose itself completely, and therefore produce a dictatorship, and the opposing groups are strong enough to prevent a dictatorship, but not strong enough to the society is collectively not strong enough to organize an orderly way of agreeing how to run the country, then the risk that we have now is a risk of anarchy, where no one group is actually in charge, and no one group has got sufficient, a big enough an edge to have its will prevail, and so it is going to be an endless situation. I mean, like what we've had in Somalia for the last more than 25 years.
Yeah, because nobody could come out. But I'm assuming we are not. Our desire isn't to have one group that can impose itself and sort of form a dictatorship.
Yeah, I mean, you see, a dictatorship the only advantage of a dictatorship over, say, an anarchical situation is that it is clear who is in charge.
Right.
In a dictatorship. There are no questions about who is
Right.
in charge. In an anarchical situation, people are in charge for a time, or different people control different places during different times. There can be a debate as to which of those two situations is the better. Both are really bad. But one of the risks that we are staring at as a country is the risk of anarchy,
Right.
because the group that is currently in power has had enough to declare a result that favors it, but doesn't have enough power to govern the country
Right.
on its own. And unless it is willing to make concessions, unless it is willing to organize an orderly discussion about how to run the country, the group that has been left out is strong enough to undermine the intentions of a group in power and keep the country in an anarchical situation.
In flux,
Yes.
pretty much. All right. Now that we're where we are, what are the fundamental things we should be looking at? I think one of the things that have been posed, the questions that have been posed in the public discourse, is whether we have a political crisis or a constitutional one. Where do you stand on this?
I think we've got a political crisis above everything else. Then the political crisis is we have got no way for the time being of deriving a leadership that is accepted across the country. We've got a constitution in place, we've got arrangements in place, but those arrangements don't yield a top leadership that all of the country accepts.
So, what would be the goal then? I mean, how should we approach this? Is the solution to basically get the two contestants, Kenyatta and Odinga, in a room and they hash out whatever they'll call it, a Nusumkate government or some form of arrangement that takes us to an election? That you think that would resolve the underlying problem?
Not necessarily. The only useful purpose of Kenyatta Odinga getting together is it is capable of resolving the immediate anxieties. There are anxieties resulting from the very, very heavy deployment of security in parts of the country. We've had violence, particularly police violence on citizens in parts of the country. There's a lot of anguish in those parts of the country as a result of what has happened immediately recently. So what we need really is a humanitarian response to those parts of the country that have been the theater of action on the part of security agencies. What we also need is a recognition that the violence that has taken place in those parts of the country is not acceptable. So there are things that need to be done immediately, and Kenyatta and Odinga getting together can have the effect of addressing the immediate, putting a halt to the immediate problems, but that is not enough. What we need on a medium term basis then is to we get a situation where they come together, is then to agree on a roadmap of discussion, a roadmap of dialogue that then resolves the medium to more long-term questions. And what ultimately the country needs is agreement on how the things that we've been talking about here, that it is really a contestation about control of the state, and that contestation is by small groups of elites that claim to represent large ethnicities, whether or not they actually do. And if we don't change that way of doing politics, then it is going to hurt all of us. So if there's agreement to and acknowledgement of that, then to go back and say, to what extent do the rules encourage this way of doing politics, and also how does our culture, our political culture, there are things that can be written into rules. How like the whole culture through under which our politics is carried out, how does it promote this zero-sum way of doing politics? Now, if we have a discussion around those issues, some rules may need to change, but more than rules changing, it is really agreeing that the rules that exist must be followed in a manner that is demonstrable
Right.
to everybody, and then leads to results that everybody is more capable of accepting.
And what forum would these sorts of discussion take? Right now, we've got NASA proposing or trying to set up what they're calling a People's Assembly. Um, uh, do you think that is the forum we should be using? Or should there be a joint one where we sit and discuss with the people in power and we say, okay, fine, let us set up a national dialogue of sorts? And who would mediate this dialogue?
Okay, NASA claims, and NASA set up the People's Assembly, criticized by Jubilee because they're saying where is its mandate, where is it deriving its mandate from? Jubilee says it has the formal authority because Parliament, as currently constituted, has the authority of the people because it's the one that is elected. So it has a formal legal mandate. Let's go to the example of what happened in Tunisia after as part of the Arab Spring. The problems of Tunisia came at a time when that country was writing their constitution. So they had a constituent assembly that was that was running the country, that was negotiating a new constitution, and then you have violence in the streets resulting from the killing of two opposition leaders in the space of 6 months. And then that supplanted the established leadership, and there were daily there were daily demonstrations in Tunis, people calling on the resignation of the prime minister, and the prime minister lost authority to govern.
Right.
So it is in that context that a group of civic leaders took upon themselves a self-appointed leadership that then managed to push Tunisia out of the crisis and avoid the kind of dysfunction that, for example, neighboring Egypt, went through. And these were trade unionists, employer unions, the human rights organization of the country, and the Bar Association of Tunisia. And they went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts. So that example shows that leadership does not have to be elected or to have to be based on election or a mandate that traces itself to law for it to be effective and for it to push a country down in the path where it should be going. So what is needed, if NASA can demonstrate that it has found a way of being inclusive, of addressing the problems of the country, then it is in principle capable of carrying the moment and carrying the country to where it ought to be going. But given the extremely polarized nature of the country's politics, it is unlikely that what NASA is doing will be sufficient. So we still are going to remain in search of something that represents the whole. What Jubilee controls can't, even if it's claimed to have the mandate of law and so on and so forth, it's insufficient. What NASA is trying is also going to be insufficient. So something other than those is needed, and is what the country is looking for.
Right. Within Kenya, you've spoken of Tunisia. I think also from Kenya's history, it seems to me we've been here before, in the contestations in the 90s especially, when we had the NCEC, National Convention Executive Council. then led by Kivuza Kibwana. And they did try to set up a national constituent assembly to discuss this, and there was lots of contestations on the same points that you're bringing up, where they were delegitimized by the Kanu regime, which said we've got the power of law, we've got the elected representatives, there's this path that we should use, and obviously NCC was saying something different. It seems to me at that time it was really led by civil society, the push to change things, and then got co-opted by politicians, and in essence, the reform agenda was gutted in that way. Should we be looking to the politicians now to set up this, or should we go outside of politics and hopefully see whether we can get civil society, perhaps religious leaders, more involved and more engaged in actually setting up the forums within which these discussions can go on?
I think politicians, because they come with the labels, they are. It's more difficult for them to speak to the country in a way that all of it can listen. Jubilee politicians, in particular, can have got an opportunity in principle to speak to the country in a different way. Why Jubilee politicians as opposed to NASA politicians? NASA is the underdog here. It controls nothing. Jubilee controls the country. If some Jubilee politicians were to break away from their party or to go against the party line and say, let's establish something that is more representative, that is more inclusive, that is more capable of listening in good faith to what the grievances of the country are against how Jubilee is running the country, they will get traction. They will get traction, including from NASA areas and NASA within the NASA support base. So it is where we are. Leadership is going to come from Jubilee, and most likely then from maybe a faction of Jubilee that has maybe a more enlightened way of looking at the problems that we face. That linking up with the rest of the country, that's capable of providing a basis for leadership. But if that doesn't suffice, then leadership is going to come from outside of the political formations. Now, for those to be effective, because of the entrenched manner of the crisis that we face, then they've got to build up a particularly big coalition for it to be capable of carrying the sway.
Civil society can lead this?
Yes, in principle, civil society can lead this, and we have been talking about it. We've come together as we, the people, in the last 3 weeks when we saw this crisis deepening, and we've been working in the last 2 years almost as Kura Yangu Sauti Yangu, and we thought that Kura Yangu Sauti Yangu was sufficient in positioning a political conversation around the election we've just held, but we felt that it is now inadequate. So we've ratcheted up coalition building again within civil society. We've reached out and have support from trades unions. We've got we are working with media or the leadership of media organizations. We are working with women's movements, and together we form the coalition that we call We the People. So We the People is positioning itself as capable of providing alternative leadership in the national interest. For us to be effective, we've got to continue getting more people into under our umbrella. But for us also to be effective, it's got to it's going to have to take courage, and people are going to have to find the courage to speak against the interests of entrenched positions that assimilate them. The nature of politics in the country is such that people claim you whether or not you claim them in return.
Right.
This you are so and so, you come from this place, so you belong to
To
us,
us, right.
and this is what you can say, and you can't say anything outside this. So unless people are going to defy that, then even what you're trying to do can't be sufficient to provide alternative
Right, but
leadership.
I think one of the ways to get away from the sort of branding you're talking about is to articulate a proper reform agenda. Do you feel that that has been done? Is that a work in progress? You know, shouldn't we sort of have a basic set of a basic agreement over the things that need changing?
I think there should be, yeah, one of the ways to attract followership is to provide clarities that don't currently exist about what the problem is, but also provide a roadmap of some sorts about how the pathway to solving the problems that have been identified. Um, the the current debate since the annulment, since last week's declaration of the results on 26th or thereafter, is that we have now finished elections, subject to any petitions that may come to the Supreme Court or whatever about this result. Then Jubilee is in a position to form government, and then Jubilee has said very clearly that then and only at that point, if they've been allowed legally, they've crossed the threshold to form government, at that point they can start talking to NASA, but not before. The question becomes to talk about what at that point. You've done your worst, and now you're saying let's talk when we are entrenched.
Right.
That is not likely to solve the problems. On the other side, NASA is saying we want elections in 90 days. That is unlikely to actually happen because if elections are to be held in 90 days, who will run them? They're going to be run by the same IBC that has just run elections, two elections, with which NASA in particular has found dissatisfaction. You to change, so that indicates that the IBC has got to be changed. Maybe it can be changed in 90 days and run elections in that 90 days. You've got a country that is dealing with the aftershocks of the violence of that followed 8th of August and the violence that has been evident since the 26th as well. So the context doesn't support a quick election. But if you take the scenario of people go back to the Supreme Court annuls the election of the 26th.
Is KHRC planning to go to?
No,
the Supreme Court?
let me say that we are not planning to go to court as KHRC, but that doesn't rule out the possibility of Kenyans out there
Anybody just filing a petition?
filing a petition.
Right.
If a petition was filed, one of the possible outcomes is that it could annul the results of the 26th. That takes us back to where we were immediately after the 8th of August.
Right.
So and demonstrates the futility of the existing mechanisms of trying to solve the crisis that we are facing, and point to the recommendations that we've made, that a larger conversation then is needed if the country is going to find a way of moving forward in
Is that larger conversation constrained by the Constitution?
No, I think the Constitution serves the people rather than people serving the Constitution. If people have a large vision for themselves, that vision should find accommodation in the Constitution.
Right. So, I mean, we don't have to simply say it's 60 days, we've got to have it in 60 days. If it turns out we can't have a free, fair, credible election in 60 days, then we can actually talk about expanding that.
In principle, we can talk about expanding that, and the constitution. We made the constitution as Kenyans, and we made it to serve us, and we can find ways and mechanisms of using the same constitution to serve us during times of crisis.
Right. I still want to get back to this idea of clarity about the things we need to talk about, because I think that's one of the more important things that very few people are saying. We've had religious leaders say all we really need to do is to change the constitution so that we can have, we don't end up with a winner-take-all system, and we can share out positions amongst the losers and stuff. Do you think the problem is that we've got a political class that needs to be accommodated in our power arrangements? Or does it go much deeper than that? And if it does, what exactly would we be saying that we need to change?
I think what NCCK has done is their recommendation in a sense is not surprising. The analysis is people are fighting to control the state, and this is the people are fighting for a chance at the feeding trough for themselves.
Right.
And currently only one side is feeding. So why don't you create more room, more feeding space?
Right.
Invite these other guys to also feed, and we are fine.
Yeah.
After that,
Everybody gets their turn to eat.
everybody gets their turn to eat, and our problems go away. Now, the problem with that recommendation is that it feeds the current dominant views by politicians about what the state exists to do. They have defined the state as that thing that exists to feed them. So if you allow more people to feed at the trough, then everything should be fine. It won't be fine because that is not how, as a country in the constitution and as a people, that is not how we have defined the state for ourselves. We have defined the state as that agency that exists for the welfare of the public, all of us. So the getting more people an opportunity to feed does not serve us.
Right.
And will leave the question of how do we get served as a public by the state. It will leave that question completely.
Yeah, which I think now we're getting towards more clarity about what we need to change. It seems to me, just as you've described it, the state and how it is perceived by the politicians, the people who control it, as a mechanism for extraction, for eating, if you will. That is what needs changing. That our overall agenda should be reform of the state, and that by enacting a constitution, in essence, we articulated a vision of what we think the state should be. I think we have gone some way towards achieving that, but many of the salient features of the colonial state, of the repressive state, remain. Whether it's a provincial administration that was simply renamed into county commissioners, etc., whether it is the fact that we have independent bodies that don't really act independently. So how do we then start a discussion that focuses on this state? Because I think we don't really talk about it as Kenyans. How do we start that discussion, and who would mediate that discussion?
I think, as I've said, again, looking at Kenya over a 50-year period, we've done well because we were not here in 63. In 63, and certainly the 60s and 70s, there an awareness about this debate that there's something wrong with the way the state is structured. That awareness was not as big as it is now. So to the extent that there's a larger level of public awareness about this, the fact that there's something wrong with the state, to the extent that that is part of what motivated a new constitution in 2010, we are on the right path. The new constitution has already articulated what the role of the state is, and so I don't think we need any more rules. What we need is continue as we've done, creating awareness, public awareness about what to expect of the state, so that the demand on the state can be maintained. Without a demand, then the state is not likely to be responsive.
Right.
So on the one side is maintaining demand, that the state ought to do something other than what it is currently doing. But secondly, we would need, if control over the state is, the elections are extremely important, because they are the only mechanism for peaceful access to control over the state. If you hold free and fair elections, they have a big effect on how the state gets to respond to people and their demands. If people elect somebody in a free election, that person gets to know that the same people can vote you out if there is another free election next time.
Right.
That then that has a big effect on how the state treats citizens and how it responds to grievances. The problem we have now is there's no relationship between state performance and who gets to access state power.
Right.
So elections don't have the effect of elections are not they are represented as there's a facade that elections are the means of accessing state power, but they are not,
But they're not.
because elections are dysfunctional.
Right.
So the way to fix the state, the way to make the state start serving people, rather than the people who take the state serving themselves, is to fix elections. If we fixed elections, then people would campaign to access power on a basis that we are going to serve, and while holding power, they will remain aware on a daily basis about whether or not what they are doing is approved by the electorate, because they can lose power the next time round.
Right.
So that is why elections become so important. They are important for how the state behaves to its citizens. They condition state behavior on a
Right.
day-to-day basis.
So, for your point of view would be our major focus should be on electoral justice, should be on ensuring that elections essentially give voice to the people.
Correct. We should go back to the basics about elections, and the basics would be from the point of view of how is registration managed, what is the population of the country, this is the population of the country, who are all the people who are eligible to vote enabled to vote, are there administrative and other types of bottlenecks, because that is the first level of control that the people in charge of the state have. They control where they access at that level. Then the next level of controls comes, of course, around campaigning, which monies are used to campaign, and who is owed whom when the campaigns end.
Right.
So all those opacities through the electoral process, they create they create debt, and those debts become the biggest. They supplant the expectations of citizens.
Right.
If you don't owe power to citizens, then you don't have to do anything for
Right.
them.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah.
So then, if we take apart the electoral system, we look at everything from registration all the way to how petitions. I suppose that would be some part of it, because one of the things the Supreme Court kept saying is we've been asking for more time, for example, to rule over presidential elections, and that doesn't. They haven't been afforded that by the legislature. So, if we have a national dialogue, that should be its basic focus: is take apart the electoral system and put it back together in a format that actually fits our circumstances.
Correct. That should be. It should be as basic as that. Take apart the electoral system. What are its constituent components? Explain them. How do they make sense? Then put it back together, and then enable us to observe it at work. When it gets when it deploys, there should be transparencies built into how it deploys, so everybody is able to satisfy themselves that it is actually working in the way that we agreed it would work.
What time frame would this take? I think civil society has talked about elections in a year's time.
That's correct.
So do you think a year is sufficient for us to do all of this?
We think if there is dedication, if there is a change of, if there is realization that the alternative is this kind of situation that will repeat itself every 5 years, then a year should be sufficient. If it isn't sufficient, we can increase the time. I don't think there should be any hurry about it. We need to do it, to give it enough time for it to work properly.
Right. So, what is the role now? There's been talk also of historical injustices and dealing with those, TGRC report and the rest. How does that fit into this? Is it the case that if we fix elections, then all these other things will sort of be added onto it?
If we fix elections, then we will fix the grievances of. If we fix elections, we will create a capacity to respond to the grievances of citizens. What exists now is a situation where it doesn't matter what those grievances are, because they are unrelated to the vote. The vote is the only way in which to say our grievances, we feel disrespected, or we feel that the government is responsive, so let's give it another opportunity to continue serving us. So all the problems that people have, the current problems, the historical injustices, the vote is not connected with whether or not those problems are addressed.
Right. So that when you go to vote, and if you feel that, for example, have issues to do with land, how you vote, if it's not reflected in who then becomes power, it's unlikely your issues will be addressed. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. And then there's a part there that has got to do with how then, if the vote is, if transparency is created around the vote, that would and should then encourage politics around issues, because then I can see the people of Nyandarua, 200,000 of them, and their votes, and how they're likely to manifest themselves. What are their interests? What are their grievances? I can speak to them and tell them, I will fix your roads because that seems to be your biggest problem here. So give me a chance. And I can go to another part of the country, and the problems there are different. It is drought, you don't have access to water, and if you give me access to power, I have got a solution for the fact that your animals die because you've got no access to water.
Okay. We were coming to the end of this discussion, but I really need to get this in, which is the salience and the fact that we seem to have reduced citizen participation in governance to the vote, and that becomes the primary way within which citizens are expected to hold government to account. But what happens in the 5 years in between votes, and how do we enable participation in that time?
I think the first layer of participation is information. So how much information people are given on a day-to-day basis, it conditions participation. So if our systems and mechanisms don't have or encourage access to information for citizens, that also ultimately undermines participation. So the first part of participation is putting out the information voluntarily to begin with, but also the second part of participation is building civic engagement and civic awareness in a way that then citizens become questioning. They have a questioning attitude that then yields information. And then the moment they have information, they have the power to question, the power to make demands. And that way, then they remain engaged. And when and they can keep a track of how performance has occurred over the period in question, and how that is related ultimately to election.
The reason I asked of it is, I mean, we have this situation where obviously politicians turn up every 5 years and then they disappear. Some of the mechanisms within the new constitution include things like rights to recall, so that citizens aren't expected to sort of keep a track and wait for 5 years. If they've got a grievance now, they should be able to act upon it and enforce, in a way, compliance through their representatives. And that is the crux of my question, is the salience that we put on elections, or the focus we put on elections, is it a bit misplaced? And should we be also looking to asking, how does everyday participation result in holding citizens being able to hold their representatives and government to account?
Okay, I think the right of recall as a constitutional mechanism, it's the way it was then positioned through ordinary legislation. It makes it a little illusory. It's very difficult to.
Because there's very people you're asking, you want to recall, you're asking them to put in place a mechanism for
you've
it.
got it requires too much. It requires too much organization for people to. But I think it's also down to at that micro level, at the subnational level, where you have other representatives like members of parliament or MCAs and so on and so forth. The issues are exactly the same. If people access power through manipulation, in effect, then that will affect how they perform. So there's a dysfunction between what people are told, the basis on which people then vote, and what they expect after they voted. Money politics has become a big thing now. So people who have got money are more likely to be elected than the people who don't have money. If the sole basis of electing a person is because they were able to give more handouts, how do you then turn that into an expectation that the person you elected because they gave you handouts is also expected to serve you?
Right.
So it isn't. So there's a whole reconfiguration that citizens need for themselves to say, for example, that we're going to elect you on the basis that you can serve us, rather than because you are rich or you've got you're able to bring all these razzmatazz to a campaign and so on and so forth, or we are going to elect you on the basis of parochial identity politics, because identity politics are not only national, even at subnational levels. You've got clan and so on and so forth. So those types of things create a mismatch between what are the genuine expectations and interests of citizens, and how the person who ends up being their representative is suited to address those interests.
Right. So from your view, the changes would also come from changing population, what they expect, why they vote.
Yes, why they make the selections that they make, and what they are telling the people who are seeking political office at the time of campaigns. What are you telling? What is the conversation going on at that time?
Yeah.
That conversation is dysfunctional at the moment. So how do you expect a conversation, a dysfunctional conversation, to yield functional representation? It can't.
It can't. So again, just to be clear, I say then Kenyans need to change themselves.
Correct.
Right. So,
Correct.
All right. One final thing. Given where we are at the moment, what do you see? Do you see us getting into a national dialogue anytime soon? Do you think that there is the wherewithal within our politicians to actually bring the country together, or do you think a third force, such as you described, is going to emerge and lead us out of the current impasse?
I think because it's going to be so difficult for say Jubilee, the one that has been declared in the last election, it's going to be so difficult for them to govern under the current circumstances. I foresee that some attempt at dialogue will be made. What I worry about is the quality and circumstances of that dialogue. It may be that it will be managed in a manner that leaves the questions only scratched rather than addressed. But something of a dialogue will obviously be attempted in the coming days.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, George. Thanks for having for coming on. And I know we've just scratched the surface of this, and hopefully we'll get you on more times to help us articulate these issues. Thanks all for watching The Elephant. My name is Patrick Kadara, and we'll see you next time.